numbers are down. It looks as though science has scared some people off, but the brave are here to take on science and the concept of a scientific revolution and what that's about. What have I got? Yeah. All right. In just any other business, I thought you might note and be interested in our world of looking at the history of information and communication. This was a Pew report that came out this week about the sources people use to get information, particularly about politics and the election. What's interesting about it, and something for us to bear in mind as we go on, is we tend to see with the internet these very dramatic upward sweeping curves. And our assumption is this is part of what's changing the world, and in many ways it might well be. But what in some ways is more interesting is when they suddenly break off and start to flatline. And everybody was saying, well, the internet is going to pass all television and all cable by the next election. As Jeff said in the very first class, we're always saying this is going to be the internet president that comes up. What's particularly intriguing about the Pew report is that for some reason the internet is almost completely flatlined at this point. Nobody seems to be able to suggest why, but as we're historians of information, it is necessarily of information or interest to us. Okay, but let's get to today's topic, because I've got a lot to get through, so I may be going at great speed. If on these occasions I do go at blistering speed and become more than usually incoherent, do slow me down or stop me, stick up a hand, say, look, I'm not following you, you're not making sense, go back a bit, rewind. Don't hesitate to do that, because we have a lot to get through, and so I tend to keep looking and seeing how much time I've got to go. But it's no good my jumping all the hurdles if nobody is coming with me. So slow me down if that becomes a habit. Okay, so science, and again, we want to put this in context with what we've been talking about before. Jeff gave us language, I gave us the printing press. Well, Butterfield comes along and says, look, the scientific revolution outshines everything since the rise of Christianity, reduces, and remember, these are Eisenstein's great benchmark points, the Renaissance and the Reformation to the rank of mere episodes. So he's saying that science is really the big kahuna. So what we want to do is understand what this is all about. Now, in doing that, I'm going to be going back, and I asked you to go back, and I know it's not easy reading to read Spratt. The Spectator is weird, but sort of easier reading. Spratt is making a complex argument that I want you to follow. Now, as we look at it historically, there are various things I want you to keep in mind. This was only earlier this month, or maybe the end of last month, large editorial in the Wall Street Journal saying, as a Wall Street Journal, Mike, global warming is bunk. Now, anybody can write that letter. What made it in some way significant that it was signed by this whole bank of serious-looking scientists who said you can't take us lightly. So it isn't simply the claim, and this will take us back to the Federalists, but who made the claim that starts to become interesting. And I hope that at least most of you managed to look at the interview on the vaccine with Anderson Cooper. Anderson Cooper is not one of my great heroes, but I think he's very interesting in this interview in taking on this guy who is, as some would say, a British crackpot, and others would say he's a British doctor, and he's a scientist. Can we say this? So bear this in mind as we go forth, that the sort of things that we are going to be looking at in the 17th century, and that Spratt was really wrestling with, are still very much with us today. So try, if you can, to keep your eyes focused on both aspects. And I am going to try to use medicine as a kind of case study, which is why that part of that is important. Okay, so again, here's our standard map. We've done our deep race through history, and we're now up into the 17th and into the 18th century. Spratt is writing in 63, I think, and the Spectator, although the issue you looked at was 1723. In fact, that particular issue actually came out in 1715, I think. So they're more or less contemporaries. And once again, although there is inevitably, given the limitations of my knowledge, a kind of Western European and Anglo bias, I'm going to try to take us not only to that tiny little cold island in the North Atlantic, not only to North America for the first time, the history of information is going to start coming to this side of the Atlantic in this period, but also Germany and Central Europe where we've been, also once more back to China, and also to Africa. So that's the global route we're all going to try and do in an hour and a half. Questions that we've again talked about as we try to assess a resolution. Well, what came before? What were they fighting with or struggling against? Who was involved? Who were the people? What happened? And what were the problems? So here you get a bunch of people trying to say, we're doing something really new, and although they wouldn't have said it at the time, we would now call them scientists. But if you stand up and make that claim, what are the kind of problems that come around? And then, assuming I've still got time, to look at the case histories of medicine. Medicine is not necessarily representative of all the sciences, but in this question that I want to ask of who to trust, it seems to me particularly interesting. One of the questions I want to ask is one that in a way brought up in the Anderson Cooper video, but in fact is one that comes down to all of us. If somebody suddenly picks up, where at me now, from here, this strange plastic or glass tube with a very long needle in the end and a strange looking fluid in the middle, and came towards you and say, can I stick this in your arm for your own good? What are the conditions on which you would say, go ahead, why not, here's my arm, and what are the conditions in which you would say, not on your life? So science is interesting, and medicine is interesting to me in this way, and it really asks us some questions about trust, and it breaks the barrier, as it breaks the skin, in many ways, between our interior world and the world outside. So that's why I want to use medicine as the case history. A little bit then on what came before, both in specific terms of England, and in general terms of scientific, or what we think of as proto-scientific practice. So Spratt is writing in the 1660s, and in talking earlier about revolution, I had talked to you about how England had gone through enormous turmoil in the previous. It had its civil war, the king had been beheaded, they had gone to a kind of proto-republic, then they had brought the king back in, and following the reappearance of the king, there were two major things, the plague, which I'll talk about when we talk about medicine, but this terrible outbreak of the plague came to England and decimated the population of London, moved out into the provinces, caused out of trauma, and of course once again raised the question of what is our medical knowledge? How do we know how to deal with something like this? And I'll get to that. The only thing that stopped the plague in some arguments, because it really centered on the great urban metropolis of London, was that London more or less caught fire, and there was this huge fire that burnt much of the center of London. And that turned out to be pretty useful if you have the plague spreading, because it kills most of the things that are spreading the plague. Not terribly good for other reasons. So these two events, and in fact, if you look, it's a little before I asked you to begin reading in Spratt, but he talks about these dreadful revolutions, not now about the fire because it hadn't happened when he was writing, but about the political revolutions. And he said, look, these people who created this society, what became the Royal Society, were doing it in the context of all these ghastly things that had gone before. Now, it wasn't simply that these terrible things had happened, but it's also to do with how people explained what had happened. Because, again, as I mentioned last time, we think, in Eisenstein's terms, of publishing in many ways as, from Eisenstein's view, spreading science and knowledge. But as I suggested, it also spreads fear and terror. And as the fire broke, and soon afterwards, all these rumors spread about why the fire had come. This is Samuel Pepys in his diary, which is a wonderful contemporary account of what's going on, so another eyewitness. And at first he says, Crewe had heard at the committee for examining the burning of the city that it was done by plots. It wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. It was bragged by several papists. And of course, England at the time was deeply anti-Catholic because it saw the two great Catholic nations of France and Spain as its enemies. And so here's the plot. Look, it's some nasty foreign religion coming in and setting fire to our city. And then all these accounts of weird prophecies that go with it. And so my Lady Carteret finds a piece of burned paper, and on the piece of burned paper there remain no more than less than these words: time is, it is done. Ooh, spooky. So everyone gets spooked. And in fact, there's even, people thought they found in Notre Dame a prophecy that this burning was going to happen. So that all these ideas, look, these horrors have happened. They may be God punishing us for the revolution. They may be our enemies coming about to destroy us, or they may simply be these weird prophecies. Ring any bells? Full of conspiracy theories about foreign countries and weird religions who might have been involved or had word in advance. And indeed, some of you have probably seen Loose Change, again, this weird but absolutely viral YouTube video, documentary, which will tell you about how it was all arranged, actually by our own government. So we live in similar contexts of people saying, and people saying, look, scientifically you can show that the metal in that building wouldn't have melted at this temperature, the building wouldn't have collapsed if it wasn't for explosives put in it. So let us not project back on the 17th century weird and fanciful beliefs or counterclaims that are scientific. We live with those today. One of the intriguing things in the London context, the people that we're talking about, is that after the fire was over, as a memorial to the fire, they put up what some of you may have seen if you've been to London, is this odd column which is called the Monument. And it's a monument to the fire. It's also something else. Does anyone else know what the monument was built as? Highly symbolically. It was built as a scientific observatory. And the idea was that from a top you could have telescopes, you could get above the city, you could look at various... But this would now, in a way, replace all this stuff, which was kind of hocus pocus, with scientific clarity and vision. So it's not only a memorial to the fire, but it's in some ways an attempt to put out not those flames, but the flames of sedition and plotting and etc., etc. So that is part of the context in which Spratt is writing and in which the society was formed. A context of all these strange ideas. There's another context which, again, it's unfortunate that Jeff is away, and normally the way we do this is that he will give the class talking about this notion of the coffee houses and the public sphere, and then I follow with science. So I'm going to have to kind of tell you about his lecture in advance. But an argument that's put forward by German Jürgen Habermas is, and he uses London as a center of this, is that at this time they developed a notion of the public sphere, from which our own idea, which we still live with today, of public opinion arises. And the idea was that instead of simply having the dictates of the government, the people started to say, look, we have to be listened to. Our opinions matter. Politicians could no more simply ignore what people were saying and thinking. And one of the central places in which that developed, oddly enough, was the coffee house. This was a place which was now open to, in theory, there are limitations to the argument, almost anybody could go in. And Habermas argues almost anybody could join in these debates. You enter the debate simply by virtue of the coherence of your argument, not your status, not whether you're a member of the aristocracy. Now there are clearly racial and gender issues that are being overlooked here. But it's an idealized view that society was starting to form its own opinions and not simply be told what to do. And of course, again, public opinion, as we look at an election, is still an enormously complex and problematic issue. Well, this in a way is when public opinion starts to arise. So we're moving to an idea when... and this will come up when we talk about public sphere, when ideas were kind of being interchanged in public and openly. And that's something that Spratt is trying to get at as well. Now, again, you get with these advantages a certain number of disadvantages. One of them, and this is why I asked you to read the essay from The Spectator, is here is this place where in Habermas's view, rational ideas are being exchanged among people. But in the view of Spectator, it's just an advertising center where people are trying to sell you hack medicines for huge prices. So there are counter views, and that's in partly why I put Spratt and The Spectator in together, because in a way one is presenting this idealized scientific world, and the other is saying, but if you go out into the real world, it really doesn't look quite like that. And that's part of the argument that I wanted to put against Eisenstein last week, is that we have to take both of these into account. And indeed, many people also said that, the trouble is, these people, they shouldn't get ideas above their station. If you talk to them about politics, they'll try to take over the government, so keep them ignorant instead. And that's an argument that we will talk in the rest of this course that goes on well into the 20th century, particularly in the United States and the South after the Civil War. People shouldn't be educated. They'll only cause trouble. Keep them ignorant. So some of this, again, will come up also when we have the class on advertising as well. Okay, so that's sort of looking ahead, but also giving context for the argument that Spratt put forward. Also in the background, then, is what we might call sort of proto-science. Roger Bacon, I won't talk much about, but this monk who began to think about early ideas of scientific experiments, and I'll say why that's significant. Francis Bacon, who I have talked about, and we'll mention probably again, who, in fact, is talked about by Spratt several times. He's seen in some ways as the great inspiration of the Royal Society. And the New Atlantis, his book, is a kind of account of setting up a kind of scientific institution where people would come together to experiment, to exchange ideas. So they looked at him very much for inspiration. And he was arguing in a way that the trouble with just people in society on their own is that we're all in a way deluded by what he sees as these various different types of idols. The idols of the tribe are those that we kind of collect their prejudices, that we collectively share by being just a member of our society. So the tribe altogether tends to have prejudices, and so it takes a lot of work to get rid of them. It's not, as other people had argued, that the mind comes into the world like a blank slate, and all we have to do is write on it. He's saying, no, the trouble is we come into the world with all these prejudices, and you have to work really hard to clear them and get down to rational thought. Arguments people still have today. The idols of the cave are more personal prejudices that we tend to have, our own disposition that have to be. The marketplace is actually not so much commercial, but more to do with how language can deceive us, and we can think we know something and we don't. And the idols of the theatre are the kind of delusions that we have in society. So Bacon said, look, it takes serious work to get rid of these idols. And so what we need are special institutions where people will concentrate on that stuff. And so Bacon, you probably didn't look, but he is early in, in fact, if you went to the very beginning of Spratt's book, there's a poem by Cowley to the Royal Society. And in that, it talks about Bacon who sought the true. And it's saying in a way, it wasn't to do with art. Art won't help us. Art is full of illusion. It's not fancy. It's not our own deluded ideas. It's not memory. What we really want is the judgment of the eye and the hand. And by that, they're really talking about experiments. So it's going to be experimental science that is going to get away from all these idols. We'll go out into the world and we'll test things. So one of the things that the Royal Society is absolutely central about is to instigate a program of rigorous experimental science that we live with today. So they're important in that way. And as Spratt said, what they wanted to do was not simply experiment, but to make faithful records. And that was terribly important. There'll be a written trace of what they'd done, so you could look at it and say, well, that was the wrong thing to do, or this is where their error lies. And what they're going to do through that is get to truth and overcome the fanciful, the misled. So again, the whole idea is, now, there are some odd ideas that run through this, and that is in a way that the world, and this was a constant belief, that the world has become more and more deluded. and that once in the past, these truths were absolutely open to anybody who walked around. But over time, we've become blind. So in some ways, we want to say that generations long before us had a clear and simple view of the world, and we've been deluded and we want to get back to it. Now, again, if you listen to many contemporary political arguments in particular, you see this argument again. There was once an ideal time, and we want to get back to it. So they were fighting in many ways against a system which had deferred to authority. That if, for instance, you were trying to look at the world, at the heavens, at astronomy, you would go back to Ptolemy. And if it was written in Ptolemy, it was true. And if it wasn't, you ignored it. And if you got a different result from Ptolemy and looking up at the sky, you were wrong. Well, the great battle against that, and probably the most famous, comes from Galileo and Tycho Brahe and Kepler and then Newton. And we suddenly start to see, as we all know, that the sun doesn't go around the Earth, that the orbits are elliptical and not circular, etc., etc. So that was a huge shift because Ptolemy had really reigned for 1,000 years, and everybody thought, or more, everyone thought, well, he's right. And as you know, the Catholic Church went berserk, and poor old Galileo suffered for it, and as did many others. So these were huge shifts when you suddenly said, look, looking outside the window is more significant than looking in Ptolemy's written works. Whereas the prejudice for so long had been in the other direction. If you want to know what's outside the window, look in this book. And so people began to talk about things like the Book of Nature. And what we're going to read is the Book of Nature. That's a different kind of book. Okay, so that's one way in which this was the start of a major shift, is that people started to say what we're going to defer to is now observation, experiments again. So also because it's going to be what we shall talk about, the same happens in medicine. Enormous deferral to, that is wonderful Greek, and we still have doctors still swear the Hippocratic Oath. So Hippocrates, but for 1800 years, people had simply said, let's follow Hippocrates. Let's follow this notion, the notion of the humours, that there are 4 humours that make up the body and they have to be in balance. So if you feel a little sick, instead of me coming at you with a syringe to stick something in you, I'll just cut your arm and make you bleed until you've lost enough blood and therefore feel better. Now, that probably isn't how we think about losing blood at the moment, but that was then given as a perfectly coherent argument. I have no nasty instruments in my pocket, don't worry, these threats. So there was then a shift, and Paracelsus, the German first, began to talk about, look, let's do some experiments. Let's actually see if doing this makes people better. And it sounds now kind of weird, but that really was regarded as radical then, hell, to experiment on people, and it is still, as we know from the MMR report, problematic. Harvey, Gabriel Harvey, anybody know who he was? De Motu Cordis, one of the great books. Yes? He did. Can you remember what in particular it was that he well, yeah, he's a founder of that, but he's particularly famous, absolutely right, for his book on the circulation of the blood. He pointed out that blood moves through the body. Before that, people just thought it just sat there still, like a liquid that's just solid. So the whole idea that it circulated was unknown. When it opened through your veins, it was just gravity that was pulling it out, not that it was something pumping it out. So enormously significant, seems simple to us now, but he went to Europe, he came back, he wrote this book, and it was revolutionary in that sense that nobody had thought of it in that way before. Okay, so this is the background against which what Spratt is writing about is going to be explained. So the next question then, well, who is involved? Spratt gives an account of this group of people who meet sometimes in Oxford, sometimes in London at Gresham College. Some of them are fairly significant names, even today. One of the great figures, designing figures, perhaps the most significant, was Robert Boyle. Anyone tell us about Boyle? What's Boyle famous for? Alison? Right, and but that's true. And what resulted from his experiments with the air pump? Do you know? Boyle's law, thank you. Anyone able to give us Boyle's law? Well, there's a constant ratio between the volume, the temperature, and the pressure of any gas. So if you increase the temperature but don't increase the volume, its pressure will rise. If you increase the volume, then its pressure will fall. So he began to understand gas. I mean, in part, he discovers the notion of a vacuum. And so rather than thinking that the world was an empty place that we walked in, there's something out there that's all around us, and in fact, to make a vacuum, to make it empty, took a great deal of work, and he did these experiments with a vacuum pump. So he became famous. Wren, Christopher Wren. Anyone help us with Christopher Wren? We'll leave the English out of this. Anybody else have Christopher Wren? How many people have been to London? Anyone seen St. Paul's Cathedral? He designed St. Paul's Cathedral. He was a great architect. And of course, he designed the London Monument. And why did he get the opportunity to design St. Paul's Cathedral? Because the old one had burnt down in the fire of London. So for him, fire was a great opportunity. Locke. John Locke was a member. Anybody heard of John Locke? Yes. And anyone can say something about him? He's actually, in some ways, for us, enormously significant. Yes, Mike. Okay, so great, very nice summary. Right? Yeah, okay, so Locke was a philosopher, a remarkable philosopher of the time, writing epistemology about theories of knowledge, but he also stands back and writes this thing, 2 treatises of government, and that is enormously influential in the American Constitution. I want to say that Deontay Jefferson couldn't have had his ideas without Locke, but Locke certainly gave him. So the society that we live in was very much shaped by this man, John Locke. So in that way, very important. He also, and we'll get to him later, was very influential in the first statute of copyright. And when we talk about intellectual property, we'll talk about that, and that actually happens in 1709, 1710, so in this period. So when we get to IP, we'll come back to John Locke. So yeah, enormously significant figure. Hooke, Robert Hooke. Anybody heard of Robert Hooke? Give someone else a chance. Michael, the only person? Oh, yes, you've heard of Hooke. The springs. Okay, so Hooke's law is the law of how springs, and indeed anything more or less elastic, will extend in proportion to the weight that you attach to it. And so there's a constant relationship. So Hooke's law is a law that still, like Boyle's law, is still current, and most people who do early physics and early chemistry will come upon these laws. Newton. Anybody heard of Newton? Oh, good. Okay, we've heard of Newton. Okay, well, he was a very significant member of the society. And Halley? Anyone heard of Halley? Alison, yes. Halley's Comet. All right, so one of the things they did a great